Three young tank crewmen, barely out of their teens, climb into their Sherman tank on a fog-drenched February morning in 1945. The war in Europe is reaching its final chapter, but the fighting remains unforgiving. Their mission seems routine enough: reconnaissance through the dense, frost-covered forests near the German border. At precisely 0800 hours, they radio their position, voices crackling through static, filled with youthful confidence. That transmission would be the last anyone ever heard from them. No distress calls, no explosions reported, no enemy contact, just silence. For 60 years, the mystery haunted military historians, veterans, and families left behind. Where did they go? What happened to Tank Commander William Carter, Gunner Anthony Morales, and driver Thomas Reed? Then, in 2005, a French farmer clearing land for development stumbled upon something buried deep beneath the soil. Something extraordinary. Something that would rewrite everything historians thought they knew about that cold February morning in 1945. The story begins in the winter of that same year, when Allied forces were pushing relentlessly into Nazi-occupied Europe. The 3rd Armored Division had been tasked with clearing the remaining German resistance scattered throughout the forested hills of Alsace, Lorraine. It was perilous work. The thick woodland provided perfect cover for ambushes, and tank crews knew that every mission could easily become their last. Still, morale was high. Victory seemed close. And these young men believed they were part of something that would be remembered for generations. Tank Crew Delta 3 consisted of 3 soldiers who had forged an unbreakable bond through months of combat. William Carter, their commander, was just 21 years old, a farm boy from Kansas. He'd enlisted right out of high school with dreams of seeing the world. His letters home to his sister spoke of rolling French hills, ancient villages, and the camaraderie of his crew, but he always avoided mentioning the horrors he witnessed, determined to shield his family from the truth of war. Carter was known for his calm under pressure and his rare ability to make even the youngest soldiers feel safe when everything around them was chaos. Anthony Morales, the gunner, was the youngest at only 19. Born to Mexican-American parents in New Mexico, he'd grown up working in his father's mechanic shop, developing the kind of hands-on skill that made him indispensable to any tank unit. Anthony, or Tony, as everyone called him, could fix nearly anything with a wrench and a bit of wire. His quick thinking had saved their Sherman more than once, and his humor could slice through tension like sunlight breaking through fog. Thomas Reed, the driver, was 20 and came from the bustling streets of Chicago. Before the war, he'd worked as a delivery driver, darting through narrow city alleys at breakneck speed. That experience made him a natural behind the controls of a 30-ton tank. He was fearless, fast-thinking, and known for his dry sarcasm that often earned a chuckle from Carter during tense moments. Together, the 3 men had survived some of the fiercest fighting of a European campaign. Their Sherman tank, marked number 62, was a veteran itself, battered and scarred from battle, but still dependable. They'd painted a small horseshoe on its turret for luck, Reed's idea. It had become a symbol of survival. February 18, 1945, dawned gray and misty across the forested valleys of eastern France. The 3rd Armored Division had begun a new round of reconnaissance missions, small probing maneuvers designed to locate what remained of German strongholds hiding deep in the trees. Delta 3's assignment seemed simple: advance along a narrow logging road roughly 8 miles from base to a small village named Bremont. Reports suggested minimal German presence. If any, an aerial reconnaissance had shown no visible movement. At 0730 hours, Carter Morales and Reed climbed into their tank and began their pre-mission checks. The engine rumbled to life. The radio came alive with chatter from nearby units. Everything appeared perfectly normal. At 0800 hours, Carter radioed in, "Delta 3 moving out. Proceeding along Route Echo toward Bremont. Will report upon arrival." The voice on the other end confirmed receipt. The mission had officially begun. Their Sherman tank rolled forward, vanishing into the cold morning mist. its steel treads chewing through frozen mud and pine needles. No further transmissions were ever received. By the time Delta 3 failed to report at their checkpoint, the division had grown concerned. By nightfall, when they still hadn't returned, search teams were dispatched. Tank crews and infantry patrols scoured the forest, combing the route Delta 3 had taken. They found tracks where the tank had veered off the main logging road, taking a smaller trail that wound deeper into the forest. But after roughly 2 miles, the tracks ended abruptly on rocky ground. No signs of battle, no debris, no explosions. It was as if the tank had simply vanished into the earth. Military investigators considered every theory imaginable. Had they been ambushed and captured? There was no evidence of fighting. Had they gotten lost and run out of fuel? Search teams covered every route within a 20-mile radius. Had they deserted? Impossible. Their service records were spotless, and morale in the unit was too high for such an act. 3 weeks later, the Army declared Tank Commander William Carter, Gunner Anthony Morales, and driver Thomas Reed missing in action. Their families received the dreaded telegrams, but without bodies or wreckage, they clung to hope. Hope that maybe, somewhere, their sons were alive. The war ended months later, but the mystery of Delta 3 remained unsolved. When peace returned, a more exhaustive search was conducted. Military recovery teams scoured the area with improved equipment, questioned local villagers, reviewed German war records, and even used early metal detectors to look for buried steel. Nothing. No sign of the tank. No trace of the men. It was as though the forest itself had swallowed them whole. Over the years, the mystery became legend, whispered about among military historians and amateur researchers. Some claimed the crew stumbled upon something they shouldn't have, perhaps a secret Allied operation or a German experimental weapon. Others believed they'd been captured and held in a hidden prisoner camp. A few even proposed they deliberately vanished, though the theory never gained much ground given what was known about their character. Their families never stopped searching for answers. Carter's younger sister kept his room untouched until her death in 1986. Morales' parents lit candles every Sunday for their son, believing somehow he'd come home. Reed's mother wrote to the War Department every February on the anniversary of his disappearance, pleading for any news. But decades passed, and the forest grew thicker, reclaiming the scars of war. Logging roads turned to overgrown trails, and time erased the last footprint of men who'd driven into the fog that morning. Yet beneath the soil, in that quiet corner of France, something remained. Something that had waited 60 years to be found. And when it finally was, what lay inside would shock the world. It happened in the autumn of 2005. A French land developer named Claude Moreau had purchased a large, forested tract of land in the Alsace region, land that had been left untouched since the war. His plan was to clear it for housing. It wasn't easy work. The forest was dense, with decades of overgrowth twisting around rotted trunks and fallen logs. Most locals stayed away from it. They said that part of the woods felt different, quiet, but heavy. Moreau didn't believe in ghosts or legends. He believed in real estate. And on an overcast October morning, one of his workers, operating a bulldozer, was about to make a discovery that would silence even the skeptics. As the machine pushed through a tangled section of underbrush, the operator heard a sharp metallic clang. At first, he thought it was just an old farm implement buried in the soil. But when he cleared more of the earth, the outline that emerged was far too large, too uniform and unmistakably shaped. It was a tank. At first glance, the olive green paint was still visible beneath streaks of rust and moss. The structure seemed oddly intact, as though time itself had chosen to protect it. Word spread fast. Within a day, local police had cordoned off the site, and French military historians were on their way. When Dr. Elise Laurent, a military archaeologist from the University of Strasbourg, arrived at the site, she immediately sensed that this was no ordinary wartime wreck. Her team began documenting everything, carefully brushing away soil and debris, measuring, photographing, cataloging. They used ground-penetrating radar to see what lay beneath, and what they found would shake even the most skeptical experts. The tank, a M4 Sherman, serial number 62, confirmed by markings on the hull, sat in a shallow depression, angled downward as though it had slid naturally into a low ditch. But there were no impact scars, no signs of destruction, no shell holes. This wasn't a tank destroyed in battle. It had been deliberately hidden. Faint remnants of camouflage netting still clung to the turret, rotted away to threads. Branches and leaves had been carefully piled over it, then swallowed by the forest over 6 decades of silence. When the hatches were finally pried open, the air that escaped was stale but dry, a strange sign of preservation. Inside, what they found made the entire team fall silent. The tank was not empty. It was lived in. The interior told a story, one of survival, desperation, and haunting resolve. Personal belongings were neatly arranged in the crew compartments. Photographs of smiling faces, wives, sisters, and parents, were taped along the steel walls. An improvised stove, crafted from spare tank parts, sat in one corner with a small collection of rusted food tins nearby. And in the commander's seat, still strapped into his harness, lay a faded leather-bound journal. It bore the initials W.C. William Carter. Dr. Lawrence's team realized they weren't uncovering wreckage. They were unearthing a story. The first pages of the journal dated back to February 19, 1945. One day after Delta, 3 had gone missing. The handwriting was firm, steady, methodical, engine intact, no enemy contact, road blocked by fallen timber, attempted detour through valley to the north, radio malfunction after static surge, will repair in the morning. It sounded calm, controlled, professional, but as the entries continued, they became more revealing. Found abandoned German outposts and clearing. Map fragments indicate hidden supply routes not on Allied charts. And then, a few days later, captured 2 German deserters trying to raid our supplies. They claim a hidden depot in the valley ahead, fuel, food, and medical kits. No radio contact. Decided to investigate. By early March, the journal shifted from routine notes to something else, a subtle undercurrent of tension. 2 deep behind enemy lines now. Haven't seen another American unit in weeks. Forest is crawling with patrols. We can't risk moving in daylight. As the weeks turn into months, Carter's entries revealed the unthinkable. He, Morales, and Reed hadn't tried to return. They had chosen to stay. Operating entirely on their own, cut off from command, they had begun a rogue intelligence-gathering operation, observing German movements, mapping fortifications, and intercepting supply routes. One entry from late March read, Tony modified a captured radio set. Can pick up enemy transmissions. Reed says it feels wrong, like eavesdropping on ghosts. But it's working. We've learned more in 2 days than headquarters knew all winter. Every line hinted at growing isolation. Their food dwindled. Their sanity stretched thin. But they refused to quit. Morales, ever mechanic, had kept the tank running far longer than should have been possible. He'd scavenged parts from abandoned German vehicles, cannibalized broken equipment, and even found ways to burn enemy fuel through the Sherman's American engine. Tony says he can make her run on anything. I believe him, Carter wrote, but the entries began to darken. Reed's coughing blood. Tony has fever. Supplies almost gone. No one's coming. Forest feels alive at night. German patrols nearby. Twice they passed within 50 yards. We stayed silent. The final entry, scrawled shakily on May 3rd, 1945, read, Tony and Reed asleep. Tank nearly out of fuel. Still listening to enemy frequencies. Germans sound desperate. Maybe the war's ending. Maybe not. If anyone finds this, tell our families we never stopped doing our duty. After that, nothing. No further entries. No signs of departure. Only the eerie stillness of the tank's cabin, frozen in time. Dr. Lawrence's team expanded the search around the site, using radar and excavation tools. What they uncovered made the mystery even deeper. Hidden around the tank were small caches of German weapons and ammunition, neatly stored in wooden crates, each labeled with dates and unit markings. They weren't battlefield leftovers. They were organized, planned. The team found makeshift observation posts, small, hidden foxholes with sandbag walls, long since collapsed. It looked less like an abandoned vehicle and more like an outpost. The strangest discovery came when they examined the ground beneath the tank. The soil wasn't natural. It had been dug and packed by hand, forming a reinforced pit as though the crew had intentionally sunk the tank for better concealment. Someone had turned that machine into a fortress. The discovery became international news overnight. Headlines read, "Lost World War II tank, found intact in French forest." American crew's final mission unearthed after 6 decades. The U.S. Army dispatched representatives from its Historical Recovery Division, and soon after, the Pentagon confirmed that the serial number matched the missing Delta III unit from 1945. Families of the lost soldiers were notified. For the first time in 60 years, they had something more than silence. But Dr. Lawrence's team wasn't finished. The tank had more secrets. And what they would soon uncover inside its steel shell and buried just a few yards away would challenge everything we thought we knew about courage, survival, and the human spirit. As the excavation deepened, Dr. Elise Lawrence's team realized the tank itself was only the beginning. The surrounding forest floor began to reveal strange, deliberate traces, evidence that Delta III had done far more than just vanish. They weren't simply missing soldiers. They had been living ghosts, waging a secret war of their own. After documenting the initial discovery, the archaeologists began a slow, meticulous dig around the site, clearing decades of fallen leaves and compacted soil. The further they searched, the more questions emerged. Beneath layers of pine roots and moss, they uncovered spent shell casings, empty fuel tins, and fragments of German field rations. Nearby, hidden beneath a decaying tarp, they found several German helmets, each marked with bullet holes and blackened scorch marks. It wasn't debris from a random skirmish. This had been a battle, but against who, no one knew. Inside the tank, restoration specialists worked carefully, removing rust from the walls and cataloging every item. They found a tin box filled with what looked like personal mementos, a silver chain with a crucifix, a folded photograph of 3 young men leaning against the tank, smiling, alive, unaware of what was to come, and tucked beneath it, a torn map covered in hand-drawn markings, arrows, notes, and coded symbols in both English and German. In the corner of the gunner's position, the team found something far more shocking, a cache of German military documents, neatly bundled and sealed in waterproof paper. The insignia on the papers was unmistakable, the Wehrmacht eagle. Each document bore official stamps and signatures, many labeled Geheim, secret. Dr. Lawrence's assistant, a linguist named Henri Vauden, began translating the documents on site. His face paled as he read the contents aloud. "These aren't just captured papers," he said quietly. "These are troop movements, supply routes, field communication codes." Delta III hadn't stumbled upon random German records. They had been collecting intelligence. Then came the discovery that stunned everyone. When technicians examined the tank's internal radio system, they noticed something odd. The wiring was not standard American design. It had been modified, carefully, ingeniously, with foreign components. Upon closer inspection, the team identified the parts: German circuitry. Tony Morales, the 19-year-old gunner mechanic, had somehow taken apart a captured German field radio and integrated it into Sherman's communication system. By doing so, he created a hybrid radio capable of receiving enemy transmissions. When the device was tested in the lab, it still worked. The system crackled faintly, alive again after 6 decades of silence. A journal entry confirmed the modification. "Tony says we can listen in now. Germans talk like they're invincible, but they're starving too. Reed thinks we should use it. I say we're already too deep in this. The archaeologists realized what it meant. These 3 young soldiers had been conducting covert intelligence operations behind enemy lines, with no orders, no backup, and no way home. And the strangest part? It had worked. The team's attention soon shifted to a spot about 100 meters north of the tank. Ground-penetrating radar had detected a hollow anomaly, roughly rectangular, with dimensions that didn't match any natural formation. They began to dig. Beneath a thick layer of collapsed logs and compacted soil, they uncovered the entrance to what looked like a bunker. Its walls were reinforced with timber, its interior lined with rusted ammunition crates turned into tables and shelves. When they finally pried open the hatch, a cold rush of air spilled out, dry, preserved, untouched. Inside, time had stopped. Lanterns, still intact, hung from nails. Maps and documents littered the tables, weighed down by stones. Empty ration cans and broken tools covered the corners. But what made the archaeologists freeze was the equipment at the far end of the bunker, a German field radio station, complete with antenna cables and decoding sheets pinned to the wall. And on the table beside it, a small wooden tag read, "Property of Sergeant A. Morales." It became clear that the men of Delta 3 hadn't simply hidden in the forest. They had built an entire underground command post. The journal had only hinted at it. We took the outpost for ourselves. German deserters helped us build something deeper. Tony fixed their radio. We listen. We learn. We move at night. Dr. Lawrence's team documented the site inch by inch. They found not only German radios and codes, but also weapons, American, German, and even French resistance arms, all stored with care. It was an operation, but one without a name, without command, without recognition. A separate notebook, likely belonging to Reed, described their activities in simple, unpolished handwriting. We've hit 5 convoys in 3 weeks. Used German uniforms to get close. Tony jams their signals before they can call for help. Carter says it's crazy, but it's working. The 3 young men had become something far more than soldiers. They were saboteurs, spies, phantoms in steel. One German after-action report, recovered from the bunker, referred to them only as the Iron Shadows. Enemy unit of unknown size operating near Bremont. Attacks from concealed vehicle, possibly Allied special forces. Several convoys lost. Morale severely affected. The idea that 3 American soldiers could cause this level of chaos, without command, without support, was unbelievable. But the evidence was undeniable. And as the archaeologists pieced together the timeline, a picture began to emerge of what really happened in those silent months of 1945. From late February through early May, Delta 3 had moved stealthily through the forest, intercepting transmissions, sabotaging German supply lines, and gathering intelligence on troop movements. They had turned the forest into their domain, a living fortress. But the human cost was mounting. Carter's final journal pages, now translated, told a heartbreaking story. Tony coughing blood again. Reed's lost weight. I can't sleep. We hear explosions far away. Allies maybe pushing east. I don't know if they even remember we exist. We could surrender, but not to them. Not after everything. We stay. We finish what we started. The final entry was written on May 3rd, just days before Germany's surrender. Reed's fever bad. Tony says we're heroes. I think we're just ghosts who forgot to die. When Dr. Laurent finished reading the journals aloud to her team, there was silence. Not a word. Only the faint hum of the excavation equipment and the rustling of wind through the pines. 3 young men, lost to history for 60 years, had fought an invisible war of their own making. They had outlasted the end of the conflict itself. But as powerful as their story was, one question still haunted the team. Where were they? The tank had no bodies. The bunker had no remains. And so, the search widened once more. Because if Delta 3 had truly lived in these woods for months after their disappearance, then somewhere among the trees, their final chapter was still waiting to be found. For weeks, the search teams combed the woods surrounding the buried Sherman. They mapped every depression, every faint metal signature, every whisper of something unnatural beneath the roots. And then, about half a mile north of where Delta III's tank had been found, a ground technician's radar picked up something strange. A cluster of uniform shapes arranged in a shallow curve beneath a ridge of stone. It didn't look like debris. It looked like design. When the team began to dig, they unearthed what appeared to be the collapsed entrance of an old wartime bunker. The air that escaped smelled ancient stale, as though sealed since the war itself. After hours of careful excavation, they broke through. Behind the sealed entrance lay a narrow tunnel, supported by rotted timber beams. The ground was littered with rusted cans, torn fabric, and shattered glass. It descended into darkness, deeper and colder with every step. Dr. Lawrence's team followed the path with headlamps, brushing aside webs and fallen wood. The tunnel curved sharply before opening into a chamber carved from the stone itself. And that was where they found it, a subterranean command post, larger than anything they'd expected. Tables made from ammunition crates, oil lanterns blackened with soot, and documents scattered like frozen leaves. German documents, Allied maps, coded papers. And there, in the far corner, a makeshift sleeping area. 3 bedrolls fashioned from military coats and blankets. It was unmistakable. This had been their base, the final home of Delta III. Among the debris sat an object that stopped everyone cold, a metal ammunition box, its lid still latched. Inside were personal items, an American lighter engraved TR, a rosary, and a small bundle of folded papers wrapped in oilcloth. The papers were fragile, but still legible. They were letters. The top one was written in William Carter's steady hand. If anyone finds this, we did what we thought was right. We stayed behind to stop what we could, and we paid for it. Don't call us heroes. Just tell our families we didn't quit. The last line trailed off, ink blurred by water or tears. Further into the chamber, etched faintly into the limestone wall, were 3 sets of names and dates, scratched by hand. William Carter, March 14, 1945. Anthony Morales, March 11, 1945. Thomas Reed, March 14, 1945. Below them, carved deeper and shakier than the rest, were the words, "We came home together." The inscription was dated March 15, 1945. Dr. Lawrence's team froze. The silence in that chamber felt almost sacred, a kind of echo from another world. It wasn't just graffiti. It was a memorial. And it meant that Carter had lived long enough to carve his own name after his crew was already gone. The excavation expanded again. Radar scans of surrounding ground revealed 2 anomalies within 30 yards of the bunker entrance, both roughly the size and shape of shallow graves. When the team carefully removed the soil, they uncovered 2 human remains. Each had been buried with care, wrapped in the remnants of German tarps. One still wore a rusted dog tag reading, Morales, A. The other, Reed, T. By the position of the graves, and by the items buried with them, it was clear these weren't battlefield burials. They were farewells, done by someone who knew both men intimately. Carter. Inside Morales' grave, they found his sidearm, cleaned, loaded, and placed beside his chest, and a Metal Gear fragment engraved with a single word, Brothers. In Reed's, a small wallet containing 2 black and white photos, one of his parents, another the 3 of them standing in front of their tank. Every item told the same story, that even at the end, they refused to surrender to despair. When forensic tests later analyzed Carter's writing on the stone wall, the cuts and depth patterns revealed something eerie. The writing was uneven, trembling, carved by a man weakened, likely dying, but still deliberate, still defiant. The final inscription, "We came home together," appeared to have been made after the others' deaths, which meant Carter had stayed alive, alone, for at least another day. Dr. Loron could only whisper when she saw it. He buried them. Then he carved their names. And then he waited for his turn. Days later, a local historian named Pierre Rousseau, who had followed the discovery in the news, came forward with a story passed down from his grandfather. His grandfather had been a member of the French resistance during the war and had once told of 2 exhausted American soldiers who appeared in their sector near the end of the conflict, starved, wounded, and begging for medical supplies. According to the tale, they refused to reveal where they'd come from, only that a third man, their comrade, was gravely ill and couldn't be moved. The resistance had given them medicine and food, but the soldiers vanished the next morning, heading back toward the forest. The old man had always believed they died out there. Now, standing near the entrance of the newly uncovered bunker, Pierre Rousseau realized his grandfather's story had finally come full circle. Guided by Rousseau's description of the area, the archaeologists discovered a narrow cave system roughly 2 miles from the tank site, partially collapsed but still accessible. They entered cautiously, scanning the walls with light. In the final chamber, they found it, carved faintly into the stone. To whoever finds this, we try to do right. Tell our families we never stopped fighting. And there, in the dust near the wall, they found a single set of dog tags. Carter W. DNA testing would later confirm what everyone already knew. Carter had made it to the caves after burying his crew. He'd stayed long enough to leave one last message, not of fear, but of peace. That inscription changed everything. It turned a wartime mystery into something far greater, a testament to willpower, loyalty, and the lengths to which ordinary men would go to do what they believed was right. 3 names carved into stone, hidden from the world for 60 years, became immortal symbols of quiet courage. They were never deserters. They were never lost. They were men who simply refused to give up, even when history forgot them. In the weeks that followed the cave discovery, Dr. Elise Laurent and her team continued their excavation with renewed urgency. Every inch of the cavern walls was photographed and scanned, every artifact cataloged with painstaking care. But it was during one of those long, silent nights, as a storm raged outside the forest canopy, that a young assistant made the most haunting discovery of all. Near the back wall of the cave, behind a loose cluster of stones, something metallic caught the beam of his flashlight. He called Dr. Laurent over. Together, they brushed away the dust and pulled free a rusted ammunition box, sealed tight with corrosion. It was heavy, heavier than it should have been. When they finally pried it open, the contents inside stopped everyone in their tracks. Inside the box were personal items, letters, photographs, dog tags, a pocket Bible, and a folded German field map. But beneath those things lay a final document. A single piece of yellowed stationery, stamped with a faded Nazi eagle. It was a letter, handwritten in trembling ink. The heading read, "To whoever finds this." It was signed William Carter. The room fell silent as Dr. Laurent began to read. Her voice was steady at first, but grew quieter with every line. "We made it this far. Tony's gone. Reed's sick. I don't know how much longer we have. We found things out here that no one will ever believe. Maybe we were meant to." The letter continued, his handwriting uneven, shaky. The ink faded in some places, as if written by a dying man. After the radio broke, Tony built a new one from German parts. "We've been listening for weeks. The Germans are planning a final push, a counteroffensive. If they succeed, they'll hit our sector hard. Thousands of our boys could die. We can't reach command, but we can stop them here. 3 men, 1 tank, no orders." Dr. Laurent's eyes moved faster, the words now unraveling the truth of what Delta 3 had done in those last desperate months. "We intercepted their codes, changed their signals, delayed their supplies, ambushed their convoys under cover of night. Tony said it felt wrong. Reed said it felt right. I said it didn't matter. Someone had to stop them." There was a pause as she turned the fragile page. The next words made her voice tremble. "The last push failed. We heard the chaos on their radios. They never made it to the front. Maybe we did something that mattered after all." And then, almost at the bottom of the page, the last paragraph, a final confession written in the same steady hand as those etched words on the cave wall. If this reaches anyone, tell them we weren't running. Tell them we fought from the shadows. Tell them we did our duty as we understood it. Tell them we came home together. When the letter ended, nobody spoke. It was as if the forest itself had fallen silent again. The team knew what they were holding wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a bridge between two worlds, the living and the long dead, between history and humanity. Dr. Loron folded the letter back into its envelope, hands trembling, and whispered the same words Carter had written 60 years earlier. We came home together. Over the next few months, the French and American governments launched a joint investigation to authenticate the find. The evidence was overwhelming. The maps and coded documents recovered from the cave matched German command plans that had only recently been declassified. Those files detailed a final German counteroffensive intended for the Alsace region in late February 1945, an operation that, according to the official record, had been canceled suddenly due to communication failures and lost supply convoys. It was now clear what had caused that failure. Delta 3 had done it. 3 men, isolated, forgotten, presumed dead, had somehow intercepted enemy signals, sabotaged their logistics, and single-handedly disrupted one of the last German offensives of the war. It wasn't speculation. It was written, mapped, and proven in the letter of a dying soldier who'd asked for nothing in return. Historians spent years analyzing the evidence. German after-action reports spoke of unknown enemy units and phantom attacks on convoys, small, surgical strikes that caused disproportionate panic. Commanders referred to them as Die Geister in Stahl, the ghosts in steel. Military analysts later concluded that the disruption caused by Delta III's actions had delayed key reinforcements to the German front by nearly 2 weeks, long enough for Allied forces to close the noose around several retreating divisions. In essence, Carter, Morales, and Reed had unknowingly shortened the war in their sector, maybe even saving thousands of lives. Yet for 6 decades, no one had known. No medals, no reports, no graves, just a tank buried in the woods, a journal sealed in its hull, and 3 names carved into stone. The more the world learned, the more the story transcended military history. It became something larger, a human story of loyalty, faith, and quiet defiance. Newspapers across France and America carried the headline, "Lost Heroes Found, the Ghost Crew of Delta III." Carter's letter was published in full, its words printed on front pages and read aloud in memorial ceremonies around the world. For many, it wasn't just a war story anymore. It was a reminder that even in the darkest places, when the world forgets you, the will to do what's right can echo forever. But there was still one final mystery to solve. If Carter had written the letter in the cave, how had it ended up sealed in that box? Hidden behind the stones? He couldn't have placed it there himself. By then, he would have been too weak. That mystery would haunt researchers for years. Some believe that members of the French resistance, the same ones Carter and Reed had met in their final days, returned to the caves after the war and sealed the box, honoring their memory. Others thought Carter himself may have done it, crawling back to the wall, placing the box in an alcove before succumbing to exhaustion. No one will ever know for sure. But one thing was certain, his words had survived. And with them, so had his story. When Dr. Loron was later interviewed about the discovery, she said something that captured the world's imagination. "We didn't just find a tank," she said softly. "We found proof that even when the world stops listening, courage still speaks." The team's work was far from over. And as they prepared to unearth the last section of the forest, more revelations about Tank 62 were yet to come. Because when they began restoring the vehicle itself, they discovered modifications and battle scars that defied belief, and confirmed that the crew of Delta III hadn't merely survived behind enemy lines. They'd fought battles that no one ever knew happened. When the discovery site was finally secured, the French government approved the removal of the Sherman tank, Tank 62, from its resting place. The process took weeks. Every inch of the machine had to be documented before the first crane ever touched it. Engineers and historians stood side by side, watching as the Earth slowly released its grip on the 30-ton relic. And when the tank finally rose from the soil after 60 silent years, the sight was breathtaking. The forest that had buried it had also protected it. Its olive drab paint was still visible beneath streaks of moss and rust. Its hull, though scarred, was intact. Even the horseshoe symbol, the one Reed had painted for luck, was still faintly visible on the turret. As the crane swung the tank into daylight, a hush fell over the crowd. It wasn't just steel they were watching. It was a time capsule of sacrifice and stubborn hope, returning to the surface to tell its story. The vehicle was transported to a military restoration facility near Strasbourg, where a joint French-American team began a full forensic analysis. They expected to find corrosion and damage typical of buried armor. What they found instead defied everything they knew about wartime engineering. The mechanics began by removing the rear panels to access the engine compartment. Within hours, they realized something extraordinary. The engine had been rebuilt, and not just repaired, reinvented. Pieces of German machinery had been integrated seamlessly with American components. Fuel pumps from a Panzer IV, a magneto system scavenged from a destroyed Tiger. Even the filtration unit was an improvised hybrid between Allied and Axis design. It was mechanical genius, improvised under impossible conditions. Dr. Lawrence's assistant, Henri Vauden, watched in awe as they laid out the pieces on a long workbench. "Whoever did this," he whispered, "wasn't just a mechanic. He was an engineer." And they all knew who it was. Anthony Morales, the 19-year-old gunner who'd learned to fix cars in his father's garage. His ingenuity had kept that tank alive long after it should have been nothing but a cold metal tomb. Further examination revealed that Tank 62 had seen far more combat than anyone ever imagined. Ballistics experts mapped over 50 distinct impact points on the armor. They identified dents, glancing shots, and deep penetrations that somehow hadn't pierced the crew compartment. At least 12 of those hits came from German anti-tank rounds, the kind of weapons that should have torn through a Sherman like paper. But they hadn't. The angles of the strikes told their own story. Each hit was positioned along reinforced sections, suggesting deliberate maneuvering during battle, the work of a skilled driver. Thomas Reed, he had driven that tank not like a vehicle, but like a living thing. By using terrain, elevation, and momentum, he'd turned survival into art. Military analysts later concluded that Delta III had engaged enemy forces at least a dozen times while isolated behind German lines, each encounter leaving a new scar in the armor. Each one survived against impossible odds. Inside the turret, technicians found another revelation. The main cannon had been modified. Morales had apparently adjusted the ammunition loading system to handle captured German shells, something no one thought possible. When they examined the barrel, they found heavy carbon scoring, proving that it had been fired multiple times, not just for defense, but for attack. These weren't men hiding. They were fighting, and fighting with brilliance. As the restoration continued, museum conservators began uncovering hidden compartments within the tank. In one of them, near the commander's seat, they found a small metal box welded into the hull, almost invisible to the naked eye. Inside it was a folded piece of cloth, an American flag, slightly burned around the edges, and beneath it a handwritten note. It read simply, "If this is ever found, know that we fought for this. Not medals, not orders, just this." It was signed only with initials, W.C., William Carter. The deeper they went, the more Tank 62 revealed itself not as a relic of war, but as a testament to human persistence. Experts determined that many of Morales' modifications would later become standard engineering practices in post-war tank design. His fuel adaptation system, a mix of Axis and Allied machinery, was nearly identical to hybrid configurations used in early Cold War prototypes. He had invented the future with nothing but broken parts and desperation. And what made it even more staggering was the condition of the internal systems. After all those years underground, the wiring, instruments, and controls were remarkably intact, preserved by a natural layer of clay that had sealed the interior airtight. When technicians powered the electrical system with a low charge for testing, a small indicator light flickered on the dashboard. For a moment, the world held its breath. After 60 years in the dark, Tank 62 was alive again. Dr. Loron later described that moment in her final field report. It was like the machine itself was remembering them, like it refused to die until their story was told. As the restoration neared completion, the team discovered one last secret hidden deep within the tank's hull, a rolled-up map wrapped in wax paper. The map showed the surrounding forest, marked with dozens of red excess and handwritten notes. Every mark corresponded to a German supply route, bunker, or munitions depot that had been destroyed during the last months of the war. Every mark told an attack, and every single one had been carried out within the estimated timeline of Delta III's disappearance. They hadn't just hidden. They had fought an entire shadow campaign, invisible to history. 3 soldiers, without orders, without recognition, had done the impossible. When the analysis was complete, Dr. Loron stood before the tank one final time. It gleamed under the restoration lights, not as a weapon, but as a monument. Her voice was quiet, but steady. "They built something eternal," she said. "Not a machine, a legacy. That legacy would soon be shared with the world." Plans were underway to transfer the restored Sherman to a permanent exhibit, one that would tell not just the story of the tank, but of the 3 men who refused to surrender. But before that could happen, one final chapter remained to be written. The reunion of Delta III's story with the families who had spent generations waiting for answers. And when those families stood face to face with the steel ghosts that had carried their sons through hell, the weight of 60 years of silence would finally break. By the spring of 2006, the story of Delta III had spread across the world. Newspapers called them the Ghost Crew. Documentaries were being planned. Historians were rewriting sections of World War II archives to include the 3 soldiers whose courage had been erased by time. But while the headlines spoke of discovery, the real story was about the people who had waited. The families who never stopped believing their boys were out there somewhere, still trying to come home. It began with a phone call. In April that year, the U.S. Army's Historical Recovery Division reached out to 3 families spread across the United States. One in Kansas, one in New Mexico, one in Chicago. For 60 years, they had lived with nothing but telegrams that read, "Missing in action." Now, they were being told that the remains of their loved ones and the tank they vanished with had been found. When the news reached Evelyn Carter, William's niece, she couldn't speak for nearly a minute. She had grown up in the shadow of her uncle's photograph, framed above the family's dining room table. Every year, her grandmother would whisper, "He'll come home one day." Now, in a way, he finally had. In New Mexico, Miguel and Rosa Morales, the great-nephews of Anthony Morales, received a call at their auto repair shop, the same one Anthony had worked in before the war. They stood in silence, surrounded by the smell of motor oil and iron, the very world their uncle had left behind. Miguel later said quietly, he didn't just fix engines, he built hope. And in Chicago, Thomas Reed Jr., the driver's nephew, heard the news in his small apartment. He was 74 years old and still kept his uncle's old dog tags on a chain around his neck. When the officer on the phone said the words, "Identified remains," he simply replied, "Then he can finally rest." In June 2006, the families were flown to France for a joint memorial organized by both the French and American governments. The event was held at the site where Tank 62 had been uncovered, now transformed into a carefully preserved memorial ground. The forest, once overgrown and wild, had been cleared just enough to reveal the scar on the earth where the tank had slept for 6 decades. Sunlight filtered through the tall pines, illuminating the steel giant that had defied time. The tank stood proudly on a raised concrete platform, fully restored. Its green paint gleamed softly in the morning light, and the small horseshoe symbol on the turret, faded but visible, remained untouched, exactly as the crew had left it. On its side, engraved in brass, were 3 names: Sergeant William Carter, Corporal Anthony Morales, Private Thomas Reed. Beneath their names, a single inscription in both English and French. They were never lost, only waiting to be found. Hundreds attended the ceremony: soldiers, historians, journalists, and locals who had lived their whole lives unaware of the secret buried beneath their own forest. But when the family stepped forward, the crowd fell silent. Evelyn Carter placed a hand on the tank's cold steel. She whispered something no one else could hear, and tears streamed down her face. Miguel Morales knelt beside the tracks and laid a small metal wrench on the ground, a tribute to the young mechanic who had once used wrenches to keep his brothers alive. Thomas Reed Jr. saluted the turret, holding his uncle's dog tags against his chest. Dr. Elise Loron stood nearby, watching quietly. To her, the families weren't just participants in history, they were its heartbeat. She approached Evelyn Carter after the ceremony, holding a folder wrapped in linen. Inside were the original pages of William's final letter, preserved and authenticated. He wrote this with his last strength, Dr. Loron said softly. I thought it belonged with you. Evelyn opened the folder and ran her fingers over the faded words. The same handwriting that had once filled letters from France, now returned from a grave. She read aloud a few lines, her voice trembling. We did our duty as we understood it. Tell our families we never stopped believing in what we were fighting for. There wasn't a dry eye in the crowd. After the ceremony, the families were invited to the newly established Museum of the Human Spirit in War, located in Strasbourg. At its center stood the fully restored Tank 62, displayed exactly as it had been found, with Carter's journal, Morales' tools, and Reed's worn driver's gloves placed inside. Visitors walked through the exhibit in silence, surrounded by displays of photographs, letters, and maps recovered from the cave. One exhibit showed a section of the limestone wall, carefully removed from the original site, the very wall where Carter had carved their names. The inscription was faint, but still legible under the light. We came home together. It became the museum's unofficial motto, a message that transcended the war, a promise written in stone by a man who refused to die forgotten. As the families prepared to return home, the U.S. Army awarded posthumous Distinguished Service Crosses to Carter, Morales, and Reed, recognizing their extraordinary valor, initiative, and sacrifice. It was an unprecedented move, because technically their actions had been unsanctioned, but the evidence was undeniable. They had changed the outcome of battles, saved lives, and embodied everything the uniform stood for. During the ceremony, a general said something that would later be quoted around the world. They fought without orders, without support, without recognition, but they never fought without purpose. In the end, they taught us what courage truly means. That evening, as the sun sank behind the French hills, the families gathered privately one last time at the edge of the forest where the tank had been found. The air was still, warm, golden with twilight. They placed 3 candles on the ground, one for each man, and watched as the flames flickered against the shadows of the trees. Evelyn whispered, "You made it home, Uncle Will. All of you did." The wind moved softly through the pines, carrying her words into the silence. For the first time in 60 years, the forest was at peace. But the story of Delta 3 didn't end there. The more historians studied the recovered documents and mechanical designs, the more they realized that the legacy of these 3 soldiers reached far beyond their own lifetimes. Their ingenuity had laid the groundwork for post-war engineering. Their intelligence gathering had reshaped entire regions of the Allied campaign. And their courage, quiet, selfless, unrecorded, had become a symbol for every soldier who vanished without a trace. Tank 62, now encased in glass, stood as proof that even when time erases memory, truth has a way of finding its way home. In the months following the memorial, the story of Delta 3 spread far beyond military circles. It was no longer just a rediscovery of three soldiers. It was a rediscovery of what endurance, brotherhood, and faith in purpose truly meant. News outlets called it the last mission. Documentaries aired in France, Britain, and the United States. A Hollywood studio even optioned the film rights, determined to tell the story in a way that would bring the ghosts of the forest back to life on screen. But for the historians and engineers who had lived the excavation firsthand, the fascination wasn't about fame. It was about legacy, the ripples of what these men had unknowingly set in motion. At the University of Strasbourg, a symposium was held later that year titled Delta III, Engineering, Morality, and Memory. Dr. Elise Laurent stood before a room packed with scientists, soldiers, and historians. Behind her, a massive image of Tank 62 was projected on the screen, its patched armor glowing under the restoration lights. She began with a line that silenced the room. "When we found that tank," she said, "we didn't just find a story of loss. We found the DNA of courage built into metal." She went on to reveal how Anthony Morales' improvised hybrid engine, once dismissed as field ingenuity, had in fact mirrored early post-war prototype designs later used by NATO engineers. The man who'd grown up fixing cars in a dusty New Mexico garage had unknowingly prefigured an era of modern mechanical innovation. His field modifications were now studied by engineering students across Europe and the United States. Entire dissertations were written about how one 19-year-old had achieved what no design lab of the 1940s had managed, a working multi-fuel tank engine. But Delta III's influence didn't end with engineering. Psychologists studying group cohesion in high-stress environments used the trio as a case study in what they called loyalty persistence, the ability of a small, isolated team to retain purpose and identity under absolute isolation. Carter's leadership, Reed's tactical brilliance, and Morales' mechanical resilience had formed a balance few military units ever achieve. Even in the face of starvation, sickness, and encirclement, they had kept fighting, not for orders, but for each other. Their journals became required reading in certain leadership courses within the French Army and the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. Students were asked to read Carter's final words aloud and discuss what it meant to do your duty as you understand it. No one ever read those lines without emotion. The French government later designated the entire area around the original site a protected historical zone. The excavation pit was sealed and covered with transparent dome, allowing visitors to stand above the earth and look down at the exact spot where Tank 62 had been found. Beneath the glass, 3 white markers were placed in a row, each engraved with a single word: faith, courage, brotherhood. It wasn't just a tribute. It was a philosophy, a reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of defiance can shift the weight of history itself. In the years that followed, Delta III's story rippled across the modern world in unexpected ways. In New Mexico, a scholarship fund was created in Anthony Morales' name for young mechanics who wanted to study military engineering. Its motto came from a line found in his field notes: "There's nothing that can't be fixed, only things not tried." In Kansas, the Carter family donated Williams' journal to the National World War II Museum, where it was placed on permanent display under a glass case beside a small plaque that read, "Written by candlelight, preserved by faith." And in Chicago, the Reed family started an annual veterans ride called the Iron Shadows Run, where motorcycle groups trace a route of Tank 62's final mission, carrying small replicas of the horseshoe emblem on their jackets. Every ride ended with the same words shouted into wind: "We came home together." But perhaps the most moving impact came not from academics or engineers, but from the men and women who served decades later. In Iraq and Afghanistan, soldiers wrote to the families of Delta III, telling them that their story had become something of a legend, passed between platoons, shared around campfires, printed on laminated cards carried in pockets next to dog tags. One U.S. Marine corporal wrote, "When we feel cut off, when comms go dark and it's just us out there, we say we're going Delta III. It means we're not lost. We're still fighting." Even modern military units began incorporating the phrase into their unofficial mottos. For many soldiers, The story wasn't about war anymore. It was about loyalty that survives even when the world stops listening. In 2007, 1 year after the discovery, the French Ministry of Defense held a final dedication ceremony at the Museum of the Human Spirit in War. The centerpiece of the exhibit was complete. Visitors entered through a long corridor lined with photographs, not of generals or politicians, but of ordinary soldiers who'd gone missing and were never found. At the end of that corridor stood Tank 62. The lights dimmed, and a single recording of Carter's words, read by an actor, echoed softly through the hall. "If this reaches anyone, tell them we weren't running. Tell them we fought from the shadows." The recording faded, and a second light illuminated the limestone wall fragment, the one carved by Carter's trembling hand. 3 names, 3 dates, and one sentence that had transcended war, time, and death itself. "We came home together." Visitors stood before it in silence. Some saluted, some prayed, others simply cried. Dr. Laurent retired from field work the following year, but she continued to speak publicly about the discovery that had changed her life. In her final interview, she said, "What I learned from Delta 3 is that history isn't written by the victors. It's written by those who refuse to disappear." When asked what she thought Carter, Morales, and Reed would want people to remember most, she paused. Then she smiled faintly and said, "That courage isn't loud. Sometimes it's just 3 young men in a forest, doing what's right when no one's watching." But even as the world moved forward, there remained one last chapter, a set of discoveries made during Tank 62's final restoration phase, revealing physical proof that the crew's defiance had gone far beyond what anyone imagined. Because when the restoration team took apart the last section of the Sherman's armor, they found something etched deep inside the metal, hidden for 6 decades. Something that no rust, no soil, and no time could erase. The restoration of Tank 62 was nearly finished when it happened. It was supposed to be a routine final inspection, a symbolic gesture before the tank was sealed behind glass for permanent display. The team at the Strasbourg facility had spent months rebuilding, preserving, and polishing every inch of the machine that had once rumbled to the force of war. But as the mechanics disassembled one of the internal armor plates for preservation testing, a worker noticed something strange. Underneath layers of primer and corrosion, hidden deep inside the steel wall, facing inward, there were faint markings. At first, they looked like scratches, maybe from shrapnel or tools. But when they shone a light across the surface, the lines formed letters, words, carved by hand. The technicians froze. They called for Dr. Elise Laurent immediately. When she arrived, they had already cleared the grime, revealing a message that no one had seen in 60 years. It was written in small, steady engravings across the inner armor just behind the commander's seat, the same place where William Carter would have sat. It read, "This tank kept us alive. It was our home, our shield, and our grave. If you find her, treat her kindly. She carried our souls." Below that 3 initials, WC, M, TR, and beneath them one final line, etched so deeply into the steel that even after decades of rust, it gleamed under the workshop lights. "We weren't lost. We were waiting." Dr. Laurent stood silently, her hand pressed against the cold metal. The room was filled with a reverent quiet, the kind that only comes when you're standing in the presence of something sacred. She whispered softly, "They knew this would be found one day." The discovery sent shockwaves through the restoration team. Historians, journalists, and military officials arrived within hours to see it for themselves. For decades, people had speculated about what happened to Delta 3, how they'd survived, how they'd vanished, what had driven them to keep fighting. But this was the answer. It wasn't mystery that defined them. It was faith. Faith that someone someday would uncover their story and understand. When the inscription was revealed to the public, it became the emotional centerpiece of the entire exhibit. Visitors would stand before a preserved panel, reading those final words. "We weren't lost. We were waiting." And you could see in their faces, realization, sorrow, admiration. Because those weren't just the words of soldiers. They were the words of sons, brothers, friends. Human beings who had faced the abyss and chosen hope instead of surrender. The phrase spread far beyond the museum walls. It appeared on memorials, on monuments, even engraved on plaques at American and French military academies. It became a universal message, not just for soldiers, but for anyone who'd ever felt forgotten or unseen. We weren't lost. We were waiting. The world began to understand what Delta III had truly left behind. Years passed, but their story refused to fade. Tank 62 remained in its glass chamber, watched over by visitors who came from across the world to stand in front of it. Veterans would rest their hands on the glass and salute. Children would press their faces close, eyes wide, as guides told them the story of 3 men who disappeared and were found again, not as victims of war, but as proof that courage can outlast death. And every year on March 15th, the anniversary of Carter's final carving in the cave wall, the museum held a candlelight vigil, 3 candles, 3 names, and a moment of silence that stretched so deep you could almost hear the echo of engines far away, rumbling through time. On the 60th anniversary of the discovery, Dr. Lauron, now in her 80s, returned to the museum for the last time. She stood before Tank 62 as the lights dimmed, surrounded by veterans, families, and children who had never known a world at war. Her voice was frail but steady. We searched for bones and found hearts instead. They built something that even death couldn't erase. The forest kept their secret, but it also kept their promise. She looked up at the engraving inside the glass, the words that haunted and healed her for decades, and whispered one final line before turning away. You waited, and we found you. As the lights in the museum dimmed, the reflection of Tank 62 shimmered softly under the glass. The horseshoe still glinted faintly on the turret, a symbol of luck, of endurance, of home. And if you stood there long enough, listening carefully to the silence, it almost sounded as if the forest outside was breathing again, carried with the faint echo of voices from long ago. Delta III moving out, proceeding a long route echo, will report upon arrival. Static, silence, then nothing, until 60 years later, when the forest finally answered back. We weren't lost. We were waiting.